curious.
You've always been curious.
I was going to be a psychiatrist.
Okay.
Before I became a neurologist, I was very interested in the mind and in the disorders of the mind. I was a psychology major in college. So I had a baseline background in psychology. And I thought about those things. And I thought about why people are the way they are and why they feel the way they feel, why they act the way they act. I'd always been curious about the human mind and behavior.
So you were already on the curiosity side. You were essentially looking for the piece of the puzzle that would kind of fall into place, that would explain some of these things that you were...
Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing that he wrote about, of course, was the somatic symptoms of trauma.
Right. The basis of his work, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which incorporated a lot of symptoms having to do with chronic psychosomatic illness.
Psychosomatic being the term that medical science puts on things that can't be traced to definitive causes, per se.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of my patients in the pain program, and I also have to say I'd seen thousands of whiplash patients because...
Car accidents.
Yes. We had a brain injury program, we had physical therapy, and we became a center for auto accident rehabilitation. And I frequently then started to get referrals of these patients to incorporate into our rehabilitation center. And I got so I was seeing at least 2 to 3 new auto accident victims a week.
Well, that's a lot of opportunity to kind of take intakes, learn about what's happening for people, learn about what people's responses are to these things. Yeah.
And these patients, most of them, 90% were women, and 90% had accidents under the speed of 10 miles per hour.
What was that saying to you before you came upon Peter's work?
Well, the people in my brain injury program quoted literature that with a 10-mile-an-hour accident, you could have a brain injury. Because all of these people had brain injury, too. They had cognitive complaints.
Cognitive complaints, sore muscles, necks, kind of hypertone there, tension. Yes. What are some of the other things that go along with it?
They had visual complaints. They couldn't focus near when they couldn't read. And they had trouble focusing or shifting focus. They had vertigo and dizziness when they moved their head. They had ringing in the ears.
Right.
They had temporomandibular joint syndrome. They began to brux and clench.
Like clenching their teeth at night?
Yeah. They all had
a startle response, hyperarousal?
Exaggerated startle.
Exaggerated startle.
And they all had the same symptoms, to one degree or another. And they also had bowel complaints.
Really?
And they had palpitation. They had visceral complaints, too. The gut and the lungs and the heart.
From a 10-mile-an-hour car accident?
10-mile-an-hour crash.
Okay, so for some time, you're kind of looking at all of that, curious and recognizing the psychological component that must be present, but then not, as far as I can tell, having a distinct answer for these things.
No particular answer, but this feeling of unease about the fact that the symptoms, and especially the brain injury diagnosis, were not compatible with the severity of the accident.
No, it's just not the image of a high impact kind of thing that would. So some day comes along and somebody hands you an article by Peter Levine, and the light goes off, I guess.
Well, the light went off that this may be more of an experience than an injury.
An experience than an injury.
Right.
An experience than an injury. Could we also say then more of an experience than an event?
Well, in other words, that the symptoms were caused by the nature of the experience, not by the impact and the disruption of physical functions of the brain, spine, and body otherwise. Something may have created this syndrome, and it was always the same, which was very strange that they would all have the same symptoms. They also all had emotional distress to one degree or another. A lot of them had actually PTSD, but I didn't know much about PTSD, and it wasn't until after I read Levine's article that I began to ask them about all of the symptoms of PTSD. And most of them had it.
That you went back and asked your patients about those symptoms. And PTSD being post-traumatic stress disorder, which is kind of a clinically relevant or accepted understanding of kind of a degree of traumatic stress.
Exactly. The auto accident victim is put on the cart and strapped down and starts to shake. The attendants will do anything they can to stop it, to encourage them to stop.
Including medication.
Including medication, including giving them some drug to stop the shaking.
Why?
And of course, shaking is what is the critical element. And then they're strapped down to the cart, even though they've been walking around the scene of the accident. They are put on the cart and strapped down.
So that's reinforcing the signal of helplessness.
It creates helplessness. It creates helplessness. And I think that trip to the hospital may be the critical traumatizing event in a lot of these victims, because a lot of them are not seriously injured, but for legal reasons, they have to strap down the head because of the neck being injured, perhaps. So that process, and then strap down until they get x-rayed in the hospital, which may be hours. And that probably is the element that really amped the severity of the trauma in these victims.
That takes a 10 mile an hour accident and turns it into something that kind of collapses a life.
But also immobilizes the person enough. I actually had a daughter this happened to, and she's never gotten over her pain. And a lot of the victims that I've seen said that as they were lying there, the pain became overwhelming, even though it was a 10-mile-an-hour accident. But it was because of their immobilization. So, but that's a kind of an extreme physical example, but that sort of permeates our culture.
Right.